This is Alan Elsner. I'm the Vice President of Communications for J Street, welcoming you to this hangout. And with me is Guy Ziv, an assistant professor at American University. Let me just put on my reading glasses to read you his bio. He is an assistant professor in the School of International Services, U.S. Foreign Service Program, teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and international negotiations. His current research focuses on foreign policy decision-making, the influence of think tanks in U.S. foreign policy, and the role of political elites in the Arab-Israeli conflict. His op-eds have appeared in both American and Israeli newspapers, such as the Baltimore Sun, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, Newsday, USA Today, and Ynet News. And he writes a blog for the Huffington Post. Who doesn't? And so I should also mention Dr. Ziv's new book, which is just behind me, Why Hawks Become Doves, which is a study of Shimon Peres and his amazing transformation during the course of his political life. It's newly published, and Guy tells me it will be out in paperback
this summer, in July.
So welcome to Guy Ziv, welcome to everybody for an interesting discussion. If you have any questions, you can submit them by email, by emailing info@jstreet.org, or you can submit them by Twitter, and our Twitter handle is @jstreet.org. And my esteemed colleague, Ben Silverstein, who is just out of the picture behind me, will be fielding those questions and passing them across. So, Guy, what do you make of the latest developments in Israel? We learned today that the election will be on March 17th. Maybe take us through the breakup of the government from your perspective and what Netanyahu has in mind.
Sure. Well, there is really no major crisis that precipitated this decision by Netanyahu. So this is really seen by many observers, myself included, as motivated by domestic political calculations. Netanyahu is planning to run yet again for prime minister, and before he does that, he needs to run for the leadership of his Likud party. And in order to do that, he needs to do what anyone needs to do when they run for a primary, which is to appeal to their base. And so the so-called crisis that we've seen in the last week or so that prompted him to fire his centrist ministers was prompted by his desire to appeal to his base. Hence, we saw the decision to go ahead with the so-called Jewish state legislation, the Jewish state bill, which was widely condemned internationally and condemned domestically, not just by the left or by the center left, but also by right-wing columnists, by former President Peres and current President Rivlin. And so, again, I think we need to see this in the context of domestic Israeli politics.
Now, it's interesting, you've written a book about Shimon Peres, and he is really the last representative of Israel's founding generation, the amazing group of people who brought Israel into existence. Do you think there's a difference between the way those individuals, I'm thinking of Ben Gurion, obviously, but also Begin, Rabin, the way they approached politics and the interests of the state of Israel, and the way that the Netanyahu generation and Netanyahu personally looks at it?
Certainly, but I would also say that there is a difference between Netanyahu and his immediate predecessors as well. So, when you look at the founding fathers, they really had the name.
And we should say there was a very prominent founding mother as well. So that
correct, absolutely.
Sorry.
The founders of the state of Israel were very much Zionists in the traditional sense, looked out for the national interests, and did things that would not be perceived as opportunistic. And I'm referring to almost all of them, including Rabin, who resigned, as you may recall, when he was prime minister first time around because his wife happened to have an illegal bank account in the United States that he had not even known about. And he resigned and gave up his position as leader of the Labor Party and as prime minister. So I don't think you would see actions like that taken by today's leaders, and certainly not by Netanyahu, who, as I mentioned earlier, does almost everything based on narrow political calculations.
Now, Shimon Peres was quoted today as saying that there will be no peace and there will be no security for Israel under Netanyahu, which is a very blunt statement. Do you think that people still listen to Peres outside of the kind of left-wing peace camp? Does he have any influence, or will that kind of quote reverberate in Israel?
I think Peres has a lot more influence today than he did a decade ago before he became president. He was, seen as the country's elder statesman, widely respected, not just by the left or by the center, but by the right as well. I don't think it's going to go very far unless the center left in Israel decides to pick up on that theme and campaign against Netanyahu on the issue of peace and security, which so far they have not done.
Now, this is an election that's being held, or at least as the campaign gets underway, against the background of violence in Jerusalem. And we've seen some really horrific incidents. We saw the heinous murder, attack on the synagogue, which left 4 worshippers and 1 Druze policeman killed. We saw the burning this weekend of the bilingual school. Just today, there's been another attack in the West Bank. In the past, when elections have been held against the background of intifadas, the prime ministers have often lost, with the exception, I guess, of Sharon during the second intifada. How do you think the ongoing violence plays into this election campaign? Does it help Netanyahu and the right, or will they be blamed for failing to provide proper security and crushing these acts of violence?
I would say the former. I think that the right tends to be rewarded when there's violence. And this is not to say that the right welcomes violence, but certainly this government has created an atmosphere that is conducive to the kind of tensions that we've been seeing. And I don't think that the average voter is going to reward the left or the center left when they see acts of violence in Jerusalem, when perhaps wrongly the right is given the credibility when it comes to national security interests. The left does not.
The polls, as we begin this campaign, seem to indicate that the country has moved pretty sharply to the right. And I think when you add up all the right-wing and orthodox parties, in Haaretz poll earlier this week, they came up to 77 seats, with the center, left, and Arab parties getting only 43 seats. How do you account for this change, and do you think it will hold steady through the campaign, or could it change?
I think it could change. In Israel, a lot can happen in 3 months, which sounds like nothing by American standards here, but in Israel, that is a lot of time. A lot of things can change. Based on the polling that we have been seeing, though, in recent months and just this week alone, if elections were held today, the right wing would sweep. They would have a sweeping victory, and Netanyahu would expand his mandate. The interesting thing here, though, is that while the average voter is more comfortable voting for a right-wing party, their views are the view of the average voter is far more moderate and far more in tune with the center parties and the center-left parties. So there's a big disconnect here between what the public is hearing from these center and center-left parties, which I think have failed to resonate with the voter. They failed to come up with a coherent and cohesive message that can turn things around.
Now, Yair Lapid was the big winner in the last election. He went from nothing to 19 seats, the second largest in the Knesset. The polls now have him maybe going down as far as 9 seats, maybe even lower than that, 9, 10, 11, depending on which poll. Is there any way for Lapid to recover after almost 2 years as the finance minister?
Lapid has really, the credibility of Lapid, and I would add Livni as well, has been eroded because the two of them were supposed to be spearheading the peace process, saving the peace process, encouraging the government to go for peace talks, to save the idea of a 2-state solution. They failed to do so, and they also failed to exit the government when they had the opportunity to do so. first after the collapse of the peace talks last April, and then again after the Gaza war, where Netanyahu had a perfect opportunity to restart peace talks and chose not to do so. And so I think that both Lapid and Livni have really lost a lot of credibility in that respect. Lapid also, of course, being the finance minister, has also had to take a hit for decisions he's made in the economic realm. So I think that the two of them will pay a price. I think that Livni will probably be integrated into another party, maybe possibly Labour Party or possibly one of the other central parties. And I think Lapid will survive, but he is no longer seen as a candidate for prime minister.
And that brings me to the next question, because one constantly reads that there is actually only one candidate for prime minister, and that's Netanyahu. It seems to be kind of a real dearth of people who are seen to have the gravitas or the credibility or the experience to lead the state of Israel. Is that so? Is Netanyahu assured to become the next prime minister and win a fourth term in office?
I'm not a betting man, but if I were to bet on it, I would say yes, he's going to win a fourth term in office. If you look at the biggest threat to Netanyahu today, the biggest threat does not come from the left, it does not come from the center, it comes from the right. Naftali Bennett will likely emerge as a big win. Naftali Bennett, of course, being the head of the Bayit HaYehudi, the Jewish Home Party, far-right party that represents the settlers' interest. And he will likely do very well and will probably get a senior portfolio. He's an ally of the prime minister, and I expect him to do very well. So when Bibi is looking around him, he's really afraid of the right wing. He's afraid of Bennett. He's afraid of Lieberman. He's afraid of Moshe Kahlon, the former Likud minister, a very popular minister who's forming his own party. These are all right-wingers. He's not afraid of Bougie Herzog, and he's certainly not afraid of Zahava Galon, the head of Meretz, even though she's probably the only politician the only party leader who's actually talking about the kind of peace and security issues that in the past Labor and other major parties have talked about.
I read a very interesting analysis today by the editor of the Times of Israel, David Horowitz, who tends to kind of trend right. But he made the interesting point that, in fact, if Netanyahu forms a coalition that's made up exclusively of right-wing and religious parties, he will not be shielded from international criticism in the same way as he has been in a coalition that's had Tzipi Livni and Yair Lapid in it. And in fact, we have seen the French Parliament vote to recognize the state of Palestine. The British Parliament has done so. Also, Spain, I believe Sweden have recognized the state of Palestine. Ireland.
Belgium's coming up next.
So,
and the European Parliament as well.
Is this in fact one of these situations where if you win and you get everything that you wish from Netanyahu's point of view, in fact it turns out to be the worst thing that could happen to you? I'm seeking some ray of silver lining.
Well, I mean, if Netanyahu wins this next election, this will be his fourth election, his fourth term. That's pretty significant. I don't even know if he's thinking about a fifth term at this point. So I'm not sure it really matters to Netanyahu in the end when he's making history as the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, surpassing David Ben-Gurion. I do think that could be a key to the left's rehabilitation and comeback. I have a hard time believing that they're going to successfully get their act together in 3 months' time. But if Netanyahu wins the big victory, I expect him to win, forms a right-wing coalition with probably the ultra-Orthodox too, I can definitely see a big political earthquake taking place in Israel in the aftermath of what that kind of government is going to do.
And internationally, Israel will become more isolated. The BDS movement will gain traction. What do you see happening in those kind of arenas? The Palestinians will presumably get UN membership as a fully accredited state. Where would things go?
Downhill. I mean, things are going that way right now. We don't need to look into the future to see that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated. We have a very interesting phenomenon taking place in Israel that most Israelis aren't even aware of. and that is that the top security officials differ strongly with Netanyahu and the direction in which his government is going. We had just a few weeks ago the head of the Shin Bet, the current head of the Shin Bet, Israeli domestic internal service, secret service, came out contradicting the prime minister when Netanyahu talks about Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, inciting violence, fomenting hatred, fomenting terrorism. He came out and said that's completely wrong. There is no evidence whatsoever that Abbas is encouraging terrorism. If anything, he's doing the opposite. We had just this past week former head of the Shin Bet, former head of the Mossad, former head of the IDF, military intelligence. All of these people are talking about the need to engage the Palestinians in a peace process, the need for Israel to take the initiative. Shabtai Shavit, the former head of the Mossad, wrote an op-ed in Haaretz talking about how we're seeing the deterioration, the threat to Zionism, and Netanyahu is to blame for much of what we're seeing right now. What was interesting here is that the following few days later, Amos Yadlin, who's the former head of military intelligence, who's now the head of the INSS, wrote an op-ed in Haaretz challenging that notion, saying, no, Israel actually is doing relatively well. It's much stronger than it was in the past. He disagreed with Shabtai Shavit's analysis, but he pointed out that Israel needs to take the initiative for peace, to preserve peace diplomacy. In other words, on that core issue, they're in agreement. There are very few security experts who agree with Netanyahu. Perhaps Bughi Ya'alon, the defense minister, is one of those. And so here there's a big disconnect between what the Israeli public thinks is happening and what the Israeli security people are saying. And that's something that I think the center and the center left could be and should be exploiting, and they haven't been doing that.
If indeed Netanyahu wins this election, there will be a lot of people who say that the two-state solution is dead. I always maintain that the two-state solution remains the only solution, and Israel can have it the easy way through negotiations, or it can have it the hard way with the international community basically losing patience and putting Israel in a box and forcing Israel eventually to come to terms. Do you think the two-state solution remains viable in either the easy way or the hard way after a Netanyahu victory?
I agree with you. I think it's going to be increasingly more difficult to go for a two-state solution, in part because of the settlements that are popping up all over the place, make it very difficult to create a contiguous Palestinian state, and in part because Palestinians are losing hope. But it is possible, and the question is whether Israel is going to lead the way or whether the international community is going to lead the way.
We have some questions that have come in over Twitter and through email. Debbie from Arizona writes, Ruby Rivlin has been a hero during the violence, promoting tolerance and fighting racism. Will his job be in danger if a more right-wing government comes in?
I don't think so. I think he's secure in his position, and he's been getting a lot of accolades from a lot of people in the country who didn't really expect all that much, to be completely frank, from this kind of former Likud Knesset member. But he's been turning out to be a very active president along the lines of his predecessor, Shimon Peres. And I don't think his job is in danger. I think he is going to make Netanyahu's life a little bit more difficult.
How long is a president elected for in Israel? Do you know offhand?
Yeah, it's a 7-year term.
And it's just one term?
Yeah, they changed it a few years ago.
So he's there for the next 7 years effectively, and after that he can't be re-elected. He's term limited.
Unless they change the system, yeah.
Okay. Another question from Daniel in LA. Is it possible the next Knesset will have no Arab parties? What will that do to the government's legitimacy, especially if violence escalates?
It is possible, but it's unlikely because what we're most likely going to see are the Arab parties unite as one bloc. And according to the poll I just saw this morning, they can get about 10 seats. Now, of course, they would be getting more seats if more Arabs voted. About half of Arab citizens in Israel don't vote. They're protesting. But if more of them voted, you would have an even larger Arab representation.
And we should explain here that there is something in Israel called Achuz HaChasima, which is the limit that you have to pass, a threshold, in order to be to have a party gain seats in parliament, and that has been raised, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, although there have been some calls to hold off on raising it until the next election, because when they raised it, they didn't expect to go into election so soon.
So where is it now?
I believe it's 3.5%, and they were going to raise it to 4.5%. I'd have to double check on that.
And when I lived in Israel back in the 80s, it was in fact 2%. So it has been raised. And if a party gets less than 2%, then what happens to the vote? So they're distributed around, or are they thrown away?
There are usually agreements that parties make with other parties, whereby excess votes, depending on the formula used, will go to another party.
I see. So in fact, raising the threshold forces parties to come together, which I think is part of the aim. So
in theory.
Okay. This next question doesn't have a name on it, but are there any gatekeepers who could throw their hats in the ring and shake things up?
So Yuval Diskin is one such potential gatekeeper. He's a former head of the Shin Bet. He's been pretty active in recent years on social media and in traditional media, very much critical of Netanyahu. I saw a rumor today or yesterday that he was possibly going to join Moshe Kahlon's new Central Party.
And maybe tell us a little bit about who is Moshe Kahlon and where does he come from?
Moshe Kahlon was a former welfare minister in Netanyahu's government. He's a former Likudnik, and was pretty hardline, right-wing on the kind of the peace and security issues, but never really focused on those issues. He focused predominantly on social welfare issues. I mean, he was the welfare minister, was a populist, is a populist, and was one of the most popular members of Netanyahu's government. And he left, presumably because a lot of the kind of mid-level Likud people who wanted to move up and become the party leader were stopped by doing so, because Netanyahu has not really encouraged that. He has not really, paved the way for young new leaders to take over. So he quit about 2 years ago, and decided, based on polls that he saw, that he was popular enough where he could throw his hat into the ring and form his own party. The party is, I don't even know if they have a name yet. As of yesterday, the party didn't even have a name. No platform, no name. And all he said was, we're going to form a new party that is going to be based on clean government, and we're going to focus on social welfare issues. But he himself is a hawk when it comes to the territorial issue.
Now, Israel does have a tradition of these new parties emerging and doing very well, and then coming into the government, and then achieving nothing, and then disappearing almost totally within another election or two. And I can cite, the example of Yigal Yadin back in 1977, the Dash Party, Democratic Movement for Change. They won 16 seats. He became the deputy prime minister. 2 elections later, they were gone. Then there was Tommy Lapid, Yair Lapid's father.
That's right. Shinui.
Change. They won, 12, 13 seats, if I'm not mistaken.
There was a Pensioners Party.
Pensioners Party. There's Yair Lapid's party.
Right.
And of course, the Kadima Party, which was Ariel Sharon's breakaway from.
That's right.
From the Likud. So is there any reason to believe that first of all, why do Israelis fall for this time and time again? And secondly, is there any reason to believe that Kahlon would be any more successful than any of his predecessors?
No, just the first time around. But no, there's no reason to believe that that's going to be a permanent fixture in Israeli politics.
Kadima, I think, has 2 seats now. It had 28, I believe, 2 elections ago, and it's predicted to get 0.
That's correct. They're disappearing.
They're disappearing. And they won't be missed. But they were the government, actually. That's the one thing that distinguishes them from all the other ones that I cited. Let me ask you about Israel's founding party, the Labour Party. They dumped their former leader, Sheli Yakimovich, and they elected Isaac Herzog. The polls show them losing a couple of seats, going from maybe 15 to 13. What's Herzog's performance been like, and what's his problem?
Well, it's not just his problem. It's the problem from it's the Labour Party problem that began with Ehud Barak and has only gone downhill since then. Where it's a party that's lost its way. When Rabin led the party or Peres led the party really stood for traditional Labour Party values, and the leader of the party ran for prime minister. And Shelley Yachimowicz didn't even pretend to aspire to the premiership until the elections. She all but ignored the security diplomatic issues, focusing almost exclusively on the socioeconomic issues like cost of living. And so they dumped her after she didn't do very well and replaced her with Herzog, who's very nice, but doesn't have the kind of credibility, doesn't have the kind of charisma that I think Israelis are looking for in leadership. Doesn't like to play dirty, and his positions are fine, but he doesn't really have a clear, cohesive, coherent message. I was looking at some of his posts on Facebook, and it was something to the effect of time to get rid of Netanyahu, we can get rid of Netanyahu, which is fine, but that's not a compelling enough message for a voter who's seeking vision or guidance. And I think that Labour is going to continue to falter until it gets its act together.
What are going to be the main issues? Is it going to be domestic, housing, the price of chocolate milk? Is the government Netanyahu going to have to account for the outcome of the Gaza war, which very few people think has changed much or made the south of Israel safer? What's it going to be fought around? What does Netanyahu want to fight it around?
I think it's going to be a little bit of everything. Socioeconomic issues will probably predominate, but hopefully, and this is really, hopefully, the center-left parties are also going to be addressing the key issues here that we talked about in this conversation. The need to restart peace talks, the need to engage in a serious negotiation with Abbas instead of undermining Abbas, the need to end incitement against Arabs, the need to end incitement against left-wing Israelis, the need to preserve the relationship with the United States, which is very important, the need to prevent a deterioration in Israel's standing in the international community in Europe and elsewhere, the need to basically pursue rational, forward-thinking policies that this government has failed to do. And if it's a referendum on those issues, I think, and if the left or the center parties can get their act together and provide that cohesive message and provide a real alternative to the right-wing demagoguery, then I think that they can do a lot better than the current polls are suggesting they will do.
Interesting, in that list of issues, you didn't say Iran, which was almost an obsession of Netanyahu for the longest time. And of course, the talks with Iran were extended just recently until March, and Netanyahu came out with a very conciliatory statement welcoming the extension. So has Iran faded from the agenda, or does it remain Netanyahu's obsession? What's going on with that?
I think it remains an obsession or concern of Netanyahu. I happen to be personally very skeptical of Iran's intentions, but I don't think that there's anything Netanyahu can do. The negotiations are going to go forward. I don't think Netanyahu is able to carry out his threat that he's been waving around for years now about possibly bombing Iran. I don't think that's going to happen. The newly appointed IDF chief of staff, Gabi Eisenkopf, is known for opposing such an attack. It's probably too late anyway. So there's not that much that Netanyahu can do other than talk about Iran's prevarications.
I have a question from Hannah, who is an AU student. Maybe she's one of your students.
Possibly.
Extra credit for Hannah. Can you talk about campaign funding? Can Americans play a role?
Campaign financing?
Yeah, campaign funding or financing.
I'm not really sure what the, I'm not really sure I understand the question about campaign funding.
I guess the
we have,
question
in the
is,
United States, we have our own campaign financing problems.
I guess the question is, can Americans give money to Israeli candidates standing in the election?
I don't know what the laws are about campaign contributions, if that's what she's asking.
I believe, because we had a brief discussion about this today, but please don't hold me to this, that is, Americans can contribute to individuals running in their party primaries, but not to parties running in the election as a whole. We'll try and check that, and if Hannah has an email address, we'll try and come back with an answer to that question. But I think that's the basic situation. Of course, you do have Sheldon Adelson, who finances the free newspaper Israel Hayom, which is known in Israel as a Bibiton because it's so pro-Netanyahu. It has never made anything close to a profit. It's basically his slush fund for Netanyahu. And Tzipi Livni was proposing a law that would have outlawed free newspapers in Israel, by extension outlawed Israel Hayom. It got past the first reading in the Knesset. There are some who think that this might have been one of the reasons Netanyahu is anxious to fire Livni and break up the government now, before he lost his wealthy Las Vegas patron. Do you think there's anything to that?
Oh, well, I've read that as well, but I really don't know what was in his mind when he fired Livni, other than probably seeing polls indicating that more and more Israelis are getting fed up with him. And he probably figured now's probably a good time for me to run and not wait until my term is up.
Can you talk a little bit more broadly about Sheldon Adelson's role in the Israeli election through his newspaper?
I mean, I think you just did. He is a very wealthy patron of Netanyahu. He and his wife both support Netanyahu personally and politically. And the newspaper is very popular because it is a free paper. And any Israeli can pick it up without paying a dime or a shekel. And so he has had, quite a bit of influence, undue influence, while other newspapers are struggling and are having to, shut down or having to fire a lot of employees. So it's really kind of twisted what media should really be in a free, democratic, pluralistic society.
My last question before we wrap up. Many of us have this kind of horrible feeling that Israel is really on an unpleasant and ultimately unsustainable path, that it has gone badly wrong, that is headed kind of over a cliff. But Israelis don't seem to share that feeling at all. How can you explain this disconnect, I guess, from the way that some of us perceive it here, many of us in J Street perceive it, and how it's looked at over there?
Well, I wonder the same thing sometimes. I think partly they're living in a bubble. It's what we've always said about Tel Aviv, right? Residents of Tel Aviv live in kind of their own bubble. And part of it is that the message is not getting across. The message that Israel is heading in the wrong direction is just not getting across. And I already alluded earlier to one of the reasons, which is that the politicians from the center are not addressing that issue. They're focusing, they're looking at the polls showing that most Israelis are concerned with, the cost of cottage cheese, right? And the cost of housing. And they're focusing on those bread and butter, socioeconomic issues, but really avoiding the more controversial diplomatic security issues. And so that message is not really coming across from the people who need to spell it out. And we hear it from the left, but the left isn't going to resonate with the average Israeli as much as the center can. And so this is really an opportunity. This election is an opportunity for the leaders of the center left, be they Yair Lapid or Bougie Herzog of Labor, or any other leader who thinks of himself or herself as a center left candidate. It is incumbent upon them to bring that message home to the voter, that Israel is in trouble and that Netanyahu's government has been going in the opposite direction, and that there are certain things that need to happen, and they need to spell out what those things are.
Let's conclude by coming back to your book, and we refer to Shimon Peres's amazing metamorphosis from hawk to dove. Ariel Sharon had something similar happen to him in the final years of his life. Is there any chance that Netanyahu, maybe you can explain how and why it was that Shimon Peres went through this change, and whether we could hope that Netanyahu might do the same thing?
So in my book, I talk about how Shimon Peres started out as a hawk on territorial issues. He opposed, during his early days, opposed territorial compromise. He supported settlements in the West Bank, built some of the first settlements in the West Bank, opposed negotiations with the PLO, opposed Palestinian statehood, and made a dramatic turnaround in the late 70s and early 80s, and really kind of went through this evolutionary process. When we saw Sharon doing that to a lesser extent, but nevertheless Sharon went through that transformation as well. Ehud Olmert did. All of Netanyahu's predecessors did. Ehud Barak did as well. Netanyahu
not
did
Shamir, not Shamir.
Not Shamir, but all of Netanyahu's predecessors since Oslo. So from Rabin on. And I think that it is unlikely that Netanyahu is going to go through that process as well. I look at cognitive openness and cognitive complexity to explain why some leaders, some individuals are more amenable to changing their views than others. And when you look at the kind of people that Netanyahu surrounds himself with, they tend to be a very limited group, mostly yes men, mostly Anglos who are religious and nationalistic. And so he's not really hearing from a wide range of perspectives. The same cannot be said for these predecessors that we just talked about. Shimon Peres, Sharon had a much more diversified group of aides, listened to them more, consulted with them more, and were less ideological. We're simply more open to change than Netanyahu. Netanyahu listened to his father, who, as you know, was a prominent historian, but Zionist revisionist, hard right. And I think that to this day, he is not going to let his father, who has passed away, he's not going to let him down. So Netanyahu, in my opinion, has not budged on the two-state solution, despite his Bar Ilan speech of 2009.
Do you think countries get the leaders and the governments they deserve?
Sometimes.
I don't think that Israel has had the leader and the government it deserved. But we'll see. The election is going to be on March 17th, just before the J Street Conference. And the J Street Conference will be the weekend after that election. So if you haven't signed up yet for the J Street Conference, I urge you to do so. There are early bird rates in effect. I think it's going to be a fascinating conference. I think we'll come at an amazing time just after the election. We will be able to analyze that, but more importantly, we'll be able to speak with one voice to the new leaders of Israel, some of whom will be at our conference. We're hoping very much to have members of the Knesset who have just been elected, maybe some first-time members of the Knesset coming to the conference. Announcements on all of those things will be forthcoming, but really now is the time to sign up. We need your voice. We need to speak to Israel. We need to be part of that dialogue. We need to be heard. Next week, we're going to have another briefing, and details will be coming through your email box. Also focusing on the Israeli election, I think we'll have a prominent Israeli journalist to lead that briefing. We'll be looking at some poll findings. So I urge you to stay tuned to that. Thank you very much to Guy Ziv, and very good luck with the book. And we hope to have you back again sometime. I think it's been illuminating. And good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I hope everyone has a good day and a good week.